They don't see the soldier. They just see this.
Go ahead.
Wait, don't jail him. Homeless veteran on trial. When judge hears his name, entire courtroom rises. Guilty as charged, Judge Sarah Parker prepared to sentence homeless veteran Mason Quinn for criminal trespassing in bank ATM vestibule. Then prosecutor read his full name, Mason Alexander Quinn, USMC. Parker's gavel froze mid-air. She knew that name from her brother's Purple Heart citation. Former Corporal Mason Quinn, 34, faced 6 months in county jail for seeking shelter from winter storm in bank vestibule. 15 years of PTSD addiction and homelessness had reduced the Marine hero to a criminal defendant whose service remained unknown. Judge Parker's hands trembled as memories flooded back her brother Michael's final letter describing the Marine who'd carried him to safety under enemy fire, saving his life before losing his own to Taliban sniper. Corporal Mason Alexander Quinn had served 2 tours with the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines in Afghanistan's deadliest province, where his squad leadership and personal courage under fire had earned him respect from Marines who followed him through Taliban strongholds that claimed American lives daily. His heroic action occurred during Operation Steel Curtain, when his patrol was ambushed by Taliban fighters using hospital as firing position. Mason had carried wounded Marine Lieutenant Michael Parker 400 meters through enemy fire to medical evacuation, absorbing sniper rounds that shattered his shoulder and ended his military career. The recommended Navy Cross never reached him due to administrative failures following his medical retirement, while his transition to civilian life became catastrophic spiral through PTSD nightmares, prescription drug addiction, and eventual homelessness that consumed 15 years of wandering through cities where his heroism remained unknown. Mason's descent included failed attempts at employment, severed family relationships, damaged by untreated combat trauma, and survival on streets where his military baron gradually deteriorated into homeless veteran stereotype that civilian populations either ignored or criminalized through vagrancy laws and public accommodation restrictions. Judge Sarah Parker had built her judicial career on fair application of law while carrying personal grief for her brother Lieutenant Michael Parker, whose death in Afghanistan had shaped her understanding of military sacrifice and veteran issues affecting judicial decisions involving former service members. Michael's final letter home had described the Marine corporal who'd saved his life during Taliban ambush, carrying him to safety, despite his own wounds, demonstrating courage that embodied Marine Corps values of never leaving fallen comrades behind, regardless of personal danger or mission complications. Sarah's appointment to criminal court had been motivated partly by desire to serve justice fairly for all defendants, particularly veterans whose service deserved recognition even when circumstances brought them before criminal justice system through issues stemming from inadequate transition support. Mason's arrest for criminal trespassing in ATM vestibule represented routine criminalization of homelessness that filled county jails with veterans whose service records remained unknown to prosecutors and judges who processed vagrancy cases without investigating defendants' backgrounds or understanding how military service connected to their current circumstances, requiring judicial consideration rather than automatic punishment. Mason's arrest began when bank security guard reported homeless vagrant sleeping in ATM vestibule during winter storm with temperatures dropping below freezing his presence allegedly deterring customers from accessing banking services during evening hours. Officers Martinez and Thompson responded, expecting routine vagrancy removal, another homeless individual whose circumstances made them perfect target for easy arrest statistics, while removing undesirable elements from commercial areas that business owners wanted cleared of social problems they couldn't solve through conventional means. Sir, you're trespassing on private property. Bank policy prohibits loitering in vestibule areas. Officer Martinez announced, examining Mason's makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and military surplus clothing that should have indicated his service background to observant law enforcement personnel. Mason's response was immediate compliance mixed with military bearing that his disheveled appearance concealed from officers whose training hadn't taught them to recognize veterans living rough on civilian streets where homelessness masked heroic service records. Officer, I understand. I was seeking shelter from hypothermia conditions. I'll move along immediately. Mason replied, his voice carrying authority earned through combat leadership despite circumstances that had reduced him to criminal suspect whose true identity would challenge assumptions about homelessness and military service. The arraignment process showcased systematic dehumanization that homeless defendants faced when their circumstances brought them into contact with criminal justice system that emphasized efficiency over investigation into root causes of vagrancy and public accommodation violations. State versus Mason Quinn, charged with criminal trespassing and public accommodation violation, announced Court Clerk Williams reading charges that could result in 6 months incarceration plus fines that homeless defendant couldn't pay without adequate employment or housing, that criminal record would make more difficult to obtain. Judge Parker's initial assessment reflected routine processing of vagrancy cases, where homeless defendants typically pleaded guilty to avoid trial costs they couldn't afford, accepting jail sentences that provided temporary shelter while creating criminal records that perpetuated homelessness through employment barriers and housing discrimination. Mr. Quinn, how do you plead to charges of criminal trespassing? Judge Parker asked, her tone reflecting judicial efficiency, rather than investigation into circumstances that might warrant alternative sentencing or treatment programs addressing underlying causes of defendant's behavior. Mason's military discipline prevented him from explaining circumstances that civilian authorities might not understand, while his pride as former Marine made him reluctant to use military service as excuse for civilian failures that he considered personal responsibility rather than institutional abandonment requiring judicial consideration. Public Defender Robert Chin, overwhelmed with cases and lacking military knowledge necessary to properly represent veterans with service-connected issues, could only offer plea bargain arrangements that avoided trial while accepting criminal conviction for actions stemming from homelessness rather than criminal intent. Your Honor, my client accepts responsibility for trespassing and requests court's mercy in sentencing, considering his circumstances as homeless individual seeking emergency shelter during dangerous weather conditions. Chen argued, weakly unaware of Mason's military background. Judge Parker prepared to impose standard sentence for repeat vagrancy offense, her judicial experience suggesting that homeless defendants typically return to criminal behavior without addressing underlying causes that perpetuated cycle of arrest, incarceration, and release without support services or housing assistance. Mr. Quinn, this court recognizes difficult circumstances facing homeless population, but private property rights must be protected through consistent law enforcement. I sentence you to 6 months county jail with possibility of early release through community service program. The gavel was falling when Prosecutor Patricia Santos read the defendant's full name for court record, Mason Alexander Quinn, United States Marine Corps Service Number 2847291. Judge Parker's hand stopped mid-strike as recognition hit with devastating emotional impact that would transform routine sentencing into extraordinary judicial intervention. Judge Parker's emotional response was immediate and overwhelming as memories of her brother's final letter flooded back with devastating clarity. The detailed description of Marine Corporal who'd carried wounded lieutenant through enemy fire sustaining severe injuries while ensuring another Marine's survival and return to family. Mason Alexander Quinn. Parker whispered, her voice barely audible above courtroom noise as she processed the impossible coincidence that brought her brother's savior before her court as homeless defendant facing incarceration for seeking shelter that his heroic service should have guaranteed through veteran support systems. "Your Honor, are you all right?" asked Court Clerk Williams, concerned by Judge's obvious emotional distress and sudden inability to complete routine sentencing that had been proceeding without complication until defendant's full military identification was read into court record. Parker's hands trembled as she set down gavel while fighting tears that judicial composure normally prevented during court proceedings, her professional demeanor overwhelmed by personal recognition of defendant whose name was inscribed on Purple Heart citation that honored her brother's sacrifice and Mason's heroism. "Bailiff, please clear the courtroom except for court personnel and defendant. I need emergency recess to review case circumstances that require judicial consideration beyond normal sentencing parameters." Parker announced, her voice carrying authority despite emotional impact that transformed routine criminal proceeding into extraordinary judicial intervention. During recess, Judge Parker accessed military records confirming Mason's service with 2nd Battalion 8th Marines and his heroic actions during Operation Steel Curtain that had saved Lieutenant Michael Parker's life while sustaining combat injuries that ended his military career and began his descent into homelessness. Bailiff Williams, contact Veterans Affairs immediately. This defendant is decorated combat veteran whose service record requires judicial review before sentencing proceeds. Also, contact media. This case represents institutional failure that requires public attention, Parker ordered. When court reconvened, word had spread through courthouse about homeless veteran whose heroic service had been discovered during routine sentencing, creating unprecedented public interest in criminal case that demonstrated broader issues affecting veteran homelessness and criminal justice system failures. Ladies and gentlemen, this court has discovered that defendant Mason Quinn is Marine Corps veteran who served with extraordinary distinction in Afghanistan, earning recommendations for Navy Cross through actions that saved American lives while sustaining combat injuries that contributed to his current circumstances, Judge Parker announced. The revelation transformed courtroom atmosphere as gallery filled with veterans court personnel and community members whose recognition of Mason's service created spontaneous demonstration of respect for military heroism that had remained hidden beneath homelessness and criminal charges that failed to acknowledge his sacrifice. News of Mason's case spread through veteran networks with military communication efficiency, as local Marine units, veteran organizations, and military families responded to reports about decorated combat veteran facing incarceration for homelessness that represented institutional failure to support military personnel who'd sacrificed for American security. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, we have Marine veteran facing jail for seeking shelter during winter storm. Corporal Quinn saved Lieutenant Parker's life in Afghanistan, but has been homeless for 15 years due to inadequate veteran support and transition assistance, announced Staff Sergeant Patricia Martinez. Local Marine recruiters, veteran service organizations, and military families converged on Courthouse with combined response demonstrating institutional support for Brother Marine, whose heroic service warranted recognition and assistance rather than criminal prosecution for circumstances stemming from inadequate veteran care. Mason Quinn represents hundreds of combat veterans whose service goes unrecognized while they struggle with civilian transition challenges that our communities should address through support rather than criminalization, announced American Legion Commander Robert Torres. The military response included coordination with Congressman Torres' House Veterans Affairs Committee member, whose authority could address broader issues affecting veteran homelessness while ensuring immediate assistance for Mason's case that demonstrated systematic institutional failures requiring federal oversight and legislative solutions protecting combat veterans from criminalization of service-connected conditions. Judge Parker's return to bench carried emotional weight that transformed routine criminal proceeding into extraordinary recognition ceremony, as she prepared to address not only Mason's immediate legal situation, but broader issues affecting veteran homelessness and criminal justice system failures. Mason Alexander Quinn, please rise. Judge Parker commanded, her voice carrying judicial authority mixed with personal emotion as she faced the Marine who'd saved her brother's life before her court as homeless defendant whose circumstances represented institutional betrayal of military sacrifice. Mr. Quinn, this court has reviewed your military service record and discovered that you are recipient of recommended Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during Operation Steel Curtain, where you carried wounded Marine to safety under enemy fire while sustaining combat injuries that ended your career. Mason stood at attention despite worn civilian clothes and homeless appearance, his military baron emerging as recognition of his service created dignity that criminal charges had temporarily obscured but couldn't permanently diminish through legal proceedings. Furthermore, Mr. Quinn, the Marine you saved was my brother, Lieutenant Michael Parker, whose final letter described your courage and sacrifice in detail that makes your presence in my courtroom both miraculous and tragic. Parker continued, her voice breaking with emotion. All charges against you are dismissed immediately. Your service to this nation warrants recognition rather than prosecution, and your current circumstances represent our collective failure to support veterans who sacrificed for American security. Parker declared, her gavel falling to dismiss charges while beginning process of institutional accountability for veteran abandonment. Congressman Michael Torres arrived with federal authority that transformed local criminal case into matter requiring congressional oversight of veteran homelessness and institutional failures affecting military personnel whose service warranted federal protection from circumstances stemming from inadequate transition support. Judge Parker Corporal Quinn's case represents systematic institutional failure affecting thousands of combat veterans whose service goes unrecognized while they face criminalization for homelessness. That stems from inadequate veteran support and transition assistance, Torres announced. Federal investigation would examine veteran homelessness patterns while evaluating whether criminal justice system discriminated against military personnel through failure to identify service backgrounds and provide appropriate alternative sentencing that addressed underlying causes rather than criminalizing symptoms of institutional abandonment. Additionally, Corporal Quinn's recommended Navy Cross was lost in administrative failures following his medical retirement, representing institutional negligence that denied him recognition earned through combat heroism that saved American lives. Torres continued. Congressional testimony would include Mason's case as example of veteran affairs reform needs while establishing federal oversight, ensuring that combat veterans received appropriate recognition and support, rather than facing criminal prosecution for circumstances stemming from service-connected conditions requiring treatment rather than incarceration. Mason Quinn's heroism in Afghanistan deserves Navy Cross presentation that was delayed 15 years through administrative failures, while his homelessness demonstrates institutional inadequacy, requiring comprehensive veteran support reform, Torres declared. Hospital Board Chairman Dr. Patricia Williams faced federal investigation while media coverage generated national attention for veteran homelessness issues affecting military personnel whose service warranted institutional protection rather than criminal prosecution for seeking basic human needs like shelter and safety. First National Bank President David Chen faced unprecedented public relations crisis as news coverage revealed that decorated combat veteran had been arrested for seeking shelter in their ATM vestibule, resulting in immediate policy changes and corporate apologies acknowledging institutional responsibility for veteran support. First National Bank apologizes to Corporal Quinn and commits to providing permanent housing assistance for veteran whose heroic service deserves corporate recognition rather than criminal prosecution for seeking emergency shelter. Chen announced in statement acknowledging community responsibility for veteran welfare. Bank policy reform included establishing Veteran Emergency Assistance Fund, providing temporary housing for military personnel facing homelessness, while creating partnership with veteran organizations, ensuring immediate support rather than law enforcement response when veterans required emergency assistance. Local business community established veteran support network, providing employment opportunities, housing assistance, and emergency services for military personnel whose transition challenges required community response rather than criminal justice intervention that criminalized service-connected conditions. Mason received immediate housing assistance, employment opportunities, and medical care, addressing service-connected conditions that had contributed to his homelessness, while community recognition honored his sacrifice through support rather than prosecution for circumstances stemming from institutional abandonment. The community response established precedent for supporting combat veterans through recognition and assistance rather than criminalization, while Mason's case became model for addressing veteran homelessness through community partnership and federal oversight, ensuring institutional accountability for military personnel whose service warranted protection and support. Within 48 hours, Mason Quinn received his long overdue Navy Cross presentation and ceremony, attended by Marine Corps Commandant, congressional representatives, and hundreds of veterans whose presence demonstrated institutional recognition for combat heroism that had remained unacknowledged for 15 years due to administrative failures. Corporal Quinn, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, you are awarded the Navy Cross, announced Marine Corps Commandant General Patricia Rodriguez, presenting decoration that Mason had earned through action saving American life under enemy fire. Mason's transformation from homeless defendant to decorated combat veteran demonstrated how military recognition could restore dignity and purpose while providing foundation for addressing underlying causes of homelessness through appropriate medical care, housing assistance, and community support that honored his sacrifice. Federal benefits included immediate disability compensation, medical care for service-connected conditions, and housing assistance that addressed 15 years of inadequate veteran support, while ensuring Mason received resources warranted by his military service and combat sacrifice that had saved American lives overseas. The Department of Veterans Affairs appointed Mason as Veteran Advocacy Coordinator, specializing in homeless veteran outreach. His personal experience and military background providing credibility that bureaucratic personnel couldn't match when counseling veterans facing similar challenges requiring understanding and institutional support. Mason's story inspired federal legislation improving veteran identification protocols in criminal justice system, ensuring that military service records were accessed before sentencing to provide appropriate alternative programs addressing underlying causes of criminal behavior stemming from service-connected conditions. Congressional Veterans Affairs committees used Mason's case to demonstrate need for comprehensive veteran homelessness prevention through enhanced support services, employment assistance, and housing programs that addressed transition challenges before they resulted in criminal behavior requiring judicial intervention. National media coverage generated awareness about veteran homelessness, while educating civilian populations about combat trauma and institutional failures affecting military personnel whose service deserved recognition and support rather than criminalization through vagrancy laws and public accommodation restrictions. Mason's case catalyzed establishment of Veterans Justice Center, providing legal assistance, housing support, and advocacy services for military personnel facing criminal charges stemming from service-connected conditions requiring treatment rather than incarceration that perpetuated homelessness through criminal records. Judge Parker established veteran court protocol ensuring military service records were reviewed before sentencing while creating alternative programs addressing underlying causes of criminal behavior through veteran-specific treatment and support services that honored military sacrifice through appropriate recognition and assistance. The courthouse, where Mason faced incarceration, became headquarters for veteran advocacy services, demonstrating community transformation when civilian ignorance was replaced by recognition of military sacrifice requiring institutional support rather than criminal prosecution. Mason continues serving veterans through advocacy and direct assistance, while his military recognition provides permanent reminder that combat heroism deserved community protection rather than abandonment through institutional failures affecting vulnerable populations requiring specialized understanding and support services. The Quinn Protocol revolutionized criminal justice procedures through mandatory military service background checks. Before sentencing, ensuring that veterans received appropriate alternative programs addressing underlying causes of criminal behavior stemming from service-connected conditions rather than standard incarceration that perpetuated homelessness and institutional abandonment. Mason addressed judicial conferences monthly, his combat experience and homelessness providing credibility that influenced criminal justice reform, while his case demonstrated successful integration of veteran recognition with judicial procedures that honored military service through appropriate sentencing alternatives. The Department of Justice created veteran court divisions, ensuring specialized handling of cases involving military personnel whose circumstances required understanding of combat trauma, service-connected disabilities, and transition challenges that conventional criminal justice couldn't address through standard procedures designed for civilian populations. Federal funding supported veteran advocacy programs, while Mason's work demonstrated how personal experience could enhance institutional understanding of military service and veteran needs requiring specialized support, rather than criminalization through vagrancy laws. Mason Quinn discovered that his combat experience combined with homelessness and judicial recognition created unique qualification for veteran advocacy that connected military service with civilian justice through programs helping veterans avoid criminal prosecution for circumstances stemming from service-connected conditions. His work with Veterans Justice Center provided direct assistance, while his Navy Cross recognition demonstrated successful transition from homelessness to community leadership through institutional support and recognition that honored military sacrifice while addressing underlying causes of veteran struggles. The courtroom where he faced incarceration became symbol of veteran justice reform, proving that recognition of military service could transform individual cases into systematic change, protecting veteran communities from institutional discrimination and inadequate support services. The courthouse incident proved that military heroism deserved recognition regardless of circumstances that brought veterans into contact with criminal justice system, while demonstrating how institutional acknowledgement could transform punishment into support when underlying causes were properly understood and addressed. Mason learned that surviving combat created responsibility for protecting other veterans from institutional abandonment. True justice recognizes service above circumstance. When courts honor military sacrifice through understanding rather than punishment, heroes emerge from shadows where society had abandoned them to suffer alone. In the end, Mason Quinn learned that the same courage that saved Marines under fire could save veterans in courtrooms. His case proved that justice delayed wasn't justice denied when recognition finally arrived to honor sacrifice that civilian society had forgotten, but military brotherhood never abandoned.